So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton, available for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Jason Furman with us. Hi, Jason.
Hello.
Jason is from Harvard and the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, as everybody knows. And he will talk about when, if ever, should we worry about debt. And so we will be excited to hear whether we should worry and how much we should worry at the common space, or should we worry only when the other party is in government? And so here is some questions he put forward, and let me just summarize the poll results. Should concerns about debt constraints be restrict essentially the immediate crisis response? Yes, no, or unsure. It's about 30% said yes, 60% no, and unsure about 10%. Which of the following would you be comfortable with stabilizing the debt as a share of GDP at 50% or lower, 100%, 150%, 200%, or 250 or more, 250 or more percent? And the answer for this was roughly 20, 45, 25, 5, and 5%. So rather on the lower side, but between 100 and 150%. And the third one was, what will be the real interest rate be in 10 years time from the 10-year treasury interest rate in 10 years time from now? Will it be at -1%? That's about 5%. At 0%, that's 12%. So the real interest rate. 1% is 40%, and 2%, 30%, and higher 14%. And will the United States ever have a debt to GDP ratio below 100% again? Only 27% think yes, and no 38%, and 35% are unsure. So sometimes the numbers don't add up to 100 because you can also choose multiple choices. So let me give some opening remarks about debt levels in general. And just yesterday, the IIF came out with a report on the debt tsunami. Essentially, what they were arguing is that, if you look at the debt here, it's the chart is from 300 to 360, that you see this unprecedented spike of debt levels. And that's, of course, not only government debt at a global scale, it is also including private debt. So the question is, how do we deal with this huge amount of debt? And we were arguing before the financial crisis, or many economists were arguing that there's a shortage of safe assets. And now there's this huge additional supply of safe assets. There might not be a shortage anymore. Of course, you might argue that there's also an additional demand coming from the uncertain times we live in. So let me just talk a little bit about government debt and safe asset. What is a safe asset? How to think about it? And I've worked on that. And what's a safe asset is an asset which you can easily retrade. So essentially, you can save for precautionary reasons in the safe asset. And if you face a negative shock, you can just sell it off and deposit onto somebody else. And this way, it's a good saving instrument for you. So it's very liquid. It holds its value. I call it often, it's a good friend. Like a good friend, it's around when you need it. So it stays liquid and valuable when you need it. And this way, even though the markets, you cannot insure because there's some frictions in the market, you cannot insure all the shocks you might face. You can partially insure by having, for precautionary reasons, you hold the safe asset. And of course, it's a very attractive asset to issue such an asset because it provides this additional service flow of insurance, this partial insurance. So you don't, as an issuer, you don't have to pay a lot of interest. So that's attractive for the issuer because it provides other services, other benefits to the holder, and that makes it a very attractive asset. But it could also be that the interest rate gets so low that it's below the growth rate of the economy. And that's, when you can actually issue a bubble-prone asset. And that's actually even more attractive for the issuer because you can run a Ponzi scheme. You can issue it more and more, and you can just pay off the new debt with new debt. But it's also dangerous in a sense because bubbles can burst. And that's a question, when will bubbles burst and when not? Technically, there's always a transversality condition to be held, but the transversality condition holds for individual households who face this idiosyncratic risk to bear, but it doesn't hold in the aggregate. And what's also important is whether you can issue this bubble-prone asset depends very much who else is issuing, whom are you competing with which other governments' debt you're competing with. And that's, makes it more tricky as well. So in general, when you introduce debt, people have to make two major decisions in their decision making. So one is, how much to save. So that's, the substitution effect, income effect, and endowment effect interacting. And typically the interest rate is not doing so much on this front, except if you are hand-to-mouth consumer or you really have high credit card debt, then it makes a huge difference. But it also affects, when you change the interest rate, the portfolio choice, how much you put in the risky capital, how much you put in the safe asset, and how much to put into money. And I would like to talk a little bit more about the difference between money and safe asset later on, and what are the differences between the two. But more generally, so there are three essentially main rates to worry about. One is the risk-free rate, the R star, the real risk-free rate. That's what came up in the poll question, or typically from government debt. Then you have the growth rate of the economy, what you get just holding the whole macro economy, or the return on capital, expected return on capital. Of course, that's risky. Government debt might be risky too in certain countries, but the return on capital is the risky one. So the growth rate of the economy is roughly also the growth rate of the whole capital stock in the economy. But when you hold the capital, you not only get the growth rate of the economy, you also get the dividend yield. So you produce something, you get something out of it. So it's actually larger than G. While if you hold the government bond, you get the growth rate of the economy. So if the supply of government bonds is growing at the same rate as the growth rate, then you get essentially nothing. But the more, if the government prints more money, it inflates essentially the value of these government bonds to some extent away. So that's why there's an inflation tax on it. But more generally, I come back to my favorite equation, which we had before, is like the real interest rate is always the time preference rate times the growth rate of the economy, plus the growth rate of the economy times the curvature of the utility function. So that's intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And then you have this precautionary term here. If the consumption is very volatile, people want to save more, and that depresses the risk-free rate. So that's why there's a minus sign here. And then you might also, if it's money, so if you consider this as a money, then you also get the convenience yield on it, because you can just use it as a medium of exchange. And I think that's what drives my thinking quite a lot. So this precautionary savings is very, very important. What it also means, in times of high uncertainty, like what we have at the moment, if you look at any uncertainty measures, the risk-free rate will be very, very low, and it will be much easier for the government to issue government bonds. And there's a lot of room to issue government debt, save assets at a very, very low interest rate. But once the uncertainty goes away, then the risk-free rate is actually potentially going up as well. And there's, of course, additional dangers once you're in a bubbly situation, that the bubbles might actually not be sustained or might burst. And that's what one has to keep in mind. So I think there should be a shift away from a mean approach more to a risk management approach of government debt. So the value at risk should matter a lot. And instead of focusing debt to GDP, where debt is a level measure and GDP is a flow measure, one should probably focus on debt servicing costs. And they're very low because the interest rates are very low, so the fiscal debt servicing costs. But they might only be low if you have enough fiscal capacity. So because there's an off-equilibrium threat in a sense, if something were to go wrong, if the bubble were to burst, you can always raise taxes and support your own government debt again. And that keeps, because you have this capacity, that keeps your interest rate low. And that capacity might, if it's not there anymore, that it might lead to potentially a spike in the interest rates, and you can't fight it. That's what you have to keep in mind. And that's why if you look at that's again what I took from the FT this morning, is that, if you look at the debt servicing costs for advanced economies, the prediction is going down, while for emerging economies, it's going up. But I think it's not wise to look only at the mean forecast. It's very much important to focus on the risk component to it. And that's why, you have to have some fan chart or something like that to capture the value at risk component. And on top of it, if you're not the US, you have to be worried about being sandwiched. So typically, it's not R versus G, it's R plus some risk premium on your government bond relative to G. That's one constraint you have to satisfy. And the other constraint you have to satisfy, you have to offer more than the US, because otherwise savers will rush into the US dollar, US Treasury. So you're sandwiched between these two constraints. And that's a challenge for emerging economies to satisfy. And that's, always when the interest rate in the US were to go up, it actually or would challenge the emerging economies a lot. And it works the other way around. In March, when the Fed cuts the interest rate, it was a huge stabilizing force for the emerging economies. So let me just finalize with two more thoughts. One is, what maturity of debt should we worry about? Okay, should we just worry about the level or the servicing cost, or should we also worry about certain maturity? So because of rollover risk, we of course have to worry about maturity of the debt as well. And is it just the average maturity issued by the US Treasury? So that's just one number, or is it just the average maturity of US Treasuries held in private hands? So not held by the central bank. And I would argue that's essentially what one has to take into account. If the Treasury issues 30-year bonds or 10-year bonds, and the Fed is buying it up and then is issuing some short-term reserves in exchange, then you have to probably look at the consolidated balance sheet of the US Treasury and the central bank, or the Fed. And that's about 3.5 years in the US. And then it raises the question, what is actually maturity of the reserves? So the central bank has also some liabilities in form of money and reserves to the banking system. And how should we deal with that? And that leads me to the question, what's the difference between debt and money? And I think that's something which I got very excited about to figure this out this year. So what's the difference between government debt and money in a world where the central bank also pays interest on reserves? So it's like, money, is it the same thing as short-term T-bills? And there is a commonality, is that both have the interest rate is floating. For short-term debt, the interest rate goes up and down, whatever the Fed is doing, and the same is true for excess reserves. But there's a big difference. Short-term T-bills, you might face rollover risk. Nobody can, you can't force anybody to hold the short-term T-bills. But reserves, you force it onto the banks. They just have to hold it. There's no way they can get away with it. So that's a very, very big difference. So it's not like short-term T-bills. So is money then more like a perpetual or console bond? So it's like issue reserves, and you will never pay back what you have issued. And that's actually indeed the case. Reserves are like have infinite maturity, like a console bond. But the difference is, a console bond typically has a fixed interest rate instead of a floating interest rate. So that's the difference. So it's, to some extent, it is like a short-term bill. To another extent, it's more like a console bond. So the reserves are very, very different in this sense, that they have a maturity of infinity, but a duration or interest rate risk like a T-bill. And that makes it very different. And then it is a big stabilizing force to some extent. And on top of it, money might give you some convenience yield, because you can use it to overcome the double coincidence of wants problems. That makes it even more attractive to issue money on top of it. So let me just conclude and say, I talked a lot about government debt and money. Of course, there's also private debt. And when we take this into account, we have to take into account that, suddenly in crisis times, as we have seen in the global financial crisis, private debt becomes very quickly public debt through bailouts. And the question is, who is issuing this private debt? And that's why I think we have to keep an eye on private debt as well. And on top of it, there's always this diabolic or doom loop. If there's more risk on the sovereign debt, there will be more risk on the private debt, and that just reinforces each other. So with this, a few remarks. I will pass it on to Jason to get his perspective, how we should deal with debt and how much we can issue at the moment to deal with the current crisis. And I should mention one last thing, the growth rate of the economy. If you can intervene now and issue a lot of public debt and intervene, of course, you avoid scarring effects. And this helps you to have a higher G, which stabilizes the situation as well. Thanks again, Jason. And the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Markus. You're a real global public good, the way you're teaching all of us all of this. I think a lot of my comments are going to be pretty congruent with what you just said. So let me, share my screen and just get started with the discussion. I want to talk about, do debts and deficit matter anymore? And some of the questions that I'll be addressing today, I think my screen isn't quite up yet, but hopefully it is now, excellent, are, number one, should the debt be a constraint on the short-term response to the depressed economy? I think it was about 60% of you said no. I was surprised about the number that said yes. So let's spend a little bit of time on that. The second is, what metrics should we use in assessing the sustainability of the fiscal trajectory? Big fan of real net interest as a share of GDP. That was in Markus's discussion, but I'll flesh that out. And then finally, what should the fiscal goal be? I don't have a great answer to that. I'll give my tentative thinking. I'm going to be focused on the US. What I'm talking about is 20 to 100% applicable elsewhere. The percentage that's applicable in part depends on your country. You know, the debt constraint is not an important one for Europe. It's not an important one for Japan, in my view, in responding right now. If you're an emerging market or developing country, you probably are facing more of a constraint in terms of debt. The metrics I talk about largely make sense wherever you are. And then what your fiscal goal should be depends a bit on the size of your economy. Are you borrowing in your own currency? Are you controlling your own monetary policy, et cetera? So in the discussion, we can talk a little bit about translation. But insofar as I don't say anything about translation, I'm talking about the United States. First, I want to provide and step back to some context. Economic policy, macro policy in 2018 and 19 was truly extraordinary and should change the way all of us think about the macroeconomy and how it functions. In the United States, over those 2 years, we had 2.6% growth. That 2.6% growth, just to get that, required a macroeconomic response that looked like it was responding to a moderate to severe recession. This is a measure of fiscal expansion. And you see the fiscal expansion there was nearly as large as the fiscal expansion for the last 2 recessions, and larger than the fiscal response to almost every previous recession before that. We also saw the Fed dramatically cut its interest rates to nearly, to just above 1%. All of this happened before COVID, before the pandemic. We were already in recession fighting mode just to keep the economy going. That's telling you something about how differently the economy is operating today relative to what we would have thought decades ago. And what it's telling us is that, broadly speaking, the story that goes under the name secular stagnation, global savings glut, what have you, has meant that there's a lot of desire for savings relative to demand in the economy, investment. And if you want that investment savings market to clear, you need lower rates to do it. This isn't a choice that central banks have made. You see it across lots of countries. This isn't an outgrowth of the financial crisis. Rates had already fallen before the financial crisis. And with economies at or near full employment, rates were already very low in 2019. This is a structural change in the economy, long in the making, likely to be persistent, some combination, and you could read it out of the equations Markus gave, of slower growth, changing demography, increased inequality, possibly a reduction in the supply of other forms of safe assets. And this should really change the way we think about fiscal policy. If you needed fiscal stimulus to get the US economy to grow in 2018 and 19, when aren't you going to need fiscal stimulus? I'm not going to go through every line in this, but wanted to have it there. Broadly speaking, when you ask why we worry about the debt, one is investment crowd out. Very hard for me to be worried about that right now. A second is intergenerational fairness. I've never really quite understood that as an argument, because future generations are going to be richer than us. As somebody that's averse to inequality, I'd rather transfer from future generations to current generations. Moreover, reducing investment will actually hurt future generations. So it depends what the debt and deficit are used for. We need to be prepared for emergencies. That's an argument you hear quite a lot. This is one where if you're talking about the United States, it just is very hard for me to get that excited about it. There was no constraint on responding to the current emergency. The UK borrowed 250% of GDP to fight World War II at a time when you didn't even know if the United Kingdom would exist in the future. Avoiding a fiscal crisis, I take this seriously. I think it's an important question. It'd be nice to know how much risk is there for a country like the United States. How much insurance do you get from lowering the debt? How much does that insurance matter? And global fiscal behavior is also an issue here. To some degree, to sell your debt, you just need to be the least ugly horse in the glue factory. Interest on debt crowds out other government spending. Interest on the debt is currently negative, adjusted for inflation. These are the traditional arguments. There's also now, another set of rooms where people are worried about financial stability. They say things like low rates are causing reaches for yield, are causing over leveraging, are increasing fragility in the banking system, are increasing the odds of a crisis. I personally am a little bit less concerned about that set of concerns than many are. But insofar as that's your set of concerns, ask yourself, how much worse would all of that be if our debt was 50 percentage points less as a share of the economy and the equilibrium interest rate was, say, a percentage point lower as a result of that? So if you're worried about too much reliance on quantitative easing, low rates, all the problems associated with that, debt reduction can even be harmful. So that's just a little bit of background by way of saying we need to think about how to change the way we understand the operation of an economy that has these chronic demand shortages, that has these lower equilibrium interest rates, where some of the arguments on worrying about the debt never made a lot of sense. Some of them make less sense now than they used to. But we also need some limiting principle. This broad agreement that we can afford more stimulus now. You see Janet Yellen, Greg Mankiw, both use very similar language to make this argument. Some people say we should do whatever it takes. We shouldn't care about the debt. There's no debt concern, et cetera, et cetera. I, in some sense, agree with that. But in some sense, that sentiment can't answer the question of, does that mean that the United States should do $100 billion or $100 trillion or some number in between? So spend whatever it takes. I, in some sense, agree with as a sentiment, but it doesn't provide any useful guidance on how you size stimulus relief. And it doesn't provide any guidance to policymakers going forward who are going to confront lots and lots and lots of different interesting and attractive in some respects policy ideas. Which can you do, which can't? What's your guidance? What's your limited principle? In the short run, you can do a top-down macro one. What's the output gap? The United States in October, we were about 4% below trend. If you look over the next year, I think it's reasonable to think the output gap is like that, with the near-term worsening of the virus, the longer-term improvements with the vaccine, and the consequences of lack of fiscal stimulus. What's the multiplier? If you're conservative, maybe say the multiplier is 0.75. Then to fill the output gap, you would need about 5% of GDP, or roughly $1 trillion in the year 2021. And my argument isn't that the particular numbers I said are correct, just gives you one way of thinking about it. Another way is bottom up, essentially micro. You can borrow an unlimited amount, but we're still redirecting scarce resources. We haven't solved the problem of scarcity. And so we want to do a cost benefit test for each of the items. That cost benefit test could be informed by our social welfare function. So testing, for example, you could have an interesting debate about whether the benefits are 10 times the costs, or maybe the benefits are 50 times the costs. I think just any parameter you had in that debate, the benefits would be far in excess of the cost. So I think that would clearly work. funding for school reopening, I think that would pass any of our tests. Unemployment insurance, when you inject a social welfare function and look at the marginal utility you get from extra money in that state of the world, I think that would pass a test. $50,000 of student loan debt relief. There are people that would benefit from that. That's not the way to answer the question. You want to have in your head, if eventually it's paid for in some form, or it means foregoing something else that we might do in the future, is it still a benefit net of that? And I'm sort of X or question mark. Finally, cash transfers to large tech companies, just to throw an example out. If you looked at the incidence analysis of that, there are middle-class families that would get money. If the United States gave money to Google, Google stock would go up, and there's middle-class people that own Google stock. If you had no budget constraint at all, you'd give money cash to Google. Not the best policy in the world, but at least it helps people. Of course, once you start thinking that you're allocating scarce resources and this has to be paid for eventually, this is a terrible idea. And we certainly wouldn't want to do this, and no one's advocating it. It's just by way of saying we have to have some budget constraint somewhere in the back of our heads to evaluate these and to motivate a cost-benefit analysis.
I have a question I would like to interject. So when you said the R-star is coming down, so Bill Janeway was wondering whether it's due to increased inequality, to whether you have a take on that. And that's, Atif Mian and Sufi pushing this line of reasoning that the rich essentially don't consume enough and they save too much, but they might be saving in some risky capital rather than in safe assets. And then when you do this cost-benefit analysis, what discount factor do you use here? Is because many of the benefits will be found in the future. And I was surprised that there in your list, there's no Green Deal.
This wasn't a full list of things. I mean, we'll come back to that.
How would you put your check or a cross on the Green Deal? How would you do the cost-benefit analysis on that? Or it depends very much what degree of Green Deal you have in mind. And
yeah. So I think inequality is one factor that's lowered R-star. More money for high income save more. That lowers the equilibrium interest rate. Of course, there's a debate about the extent to which wealth inequality has gone up. A lot of that depends on measurement issues. It depends on how you consider things like the value of Social Security benefits. I know when Rochelle and Summers in their Brookings paper did the decomposition of the decline in R-star, inequality is one of the factors. It wasn't the biggest factor. I think demography and productivity growth were bigger parts of it. The Green New Deal, the legislative language is that you should form a committee to come back and have a Green New Deal. So it's a little bit hard for me to do a cost-benefit analysis when I don't quite know what it is. Climate change, of course, is something where the tax to deal with it, pricing carbon, is something you want to do not for deficit reduction, but as a Pigouvian tax. So I think 90% of what you want to do with climate change is price carbon. The other 10% is research, and then maybe certain technology forcing and networks around things like electric vehicle charging. So I think the Green New Deal probably has some good things in it. I think insofar as it's a diversion from pricing carbon, that's a problem. And I'm more excited about the research parts of it than trolley cars. So I think right now there's not a whole lot of debate that more stimulus and relief is needed. There's not a whole lot of debate that we shouldn't be overly concerned about borrowing costs. That's the message that the IMF delivers, the World Bank delivers, the OECD delivers, policymakers in many of our countries have delivered as well. There is a bigger debate about whether we should be concerned over the medium and longer run. Is this something we should be worried about? Is this something we should not be worried about? Let me just say at the outset, for almost all of the US numbers I show you, I am using the latest Congressional Budget Office, but I'm adding in and adjusting those numbers to assume that the 2017 tax cuts are made permanent. CBO, of course, is the most unbiased and reasonable set of numbers. They came up with them in June. The economy is doing a lot better than they expected back in June, so that might make all of this should be a little bit more favorable, but additional stimulus might still be passed, which would go in the other direction. So how concerned should we be about this? There's two views that give really easy answers to that question. One view is modern monetary theory. It says, don't worry, be happy. You don't need to worry about sovereign countries borrowing in their own currency. And the thing about MMT is there's different subtlety, different versions. It's constantly changing the way it's described. But broadly speaking, it has the view that that's almost always applicable, that view that you don't need to worry. Extreme fiscal hawks are always worried. Sometimes the extreme fiscal hawks are in a situation where their advice makes sense, but not always. Sometimes MMT is in a position where their advice makes sense. We might be in one of those moments now, but that's not always true. And by the way, we didn't need modern monetary theory to understand that fiscal stimulus in a depressed economy is a good idea. Just the textbook economics that we teach all of our students gets you that as well. So I don't think either of these frameworks are very useful. The metric one hears and sees the most is debt as a share of GDP. I myself have used it a lot of times, but it's problematic as a metric. It's problematic for a few reasons. The first is that debt is a stock, and it's also a backward-looking stock. GDP is a flow. It's the amount that you produce in a given year. And if you looked at the United States, what's the stock version of GDP? It's about $4 quadrillion, according to the Social Security trustees, or maybe it's infinity dollars, if you think R is less than G. It's not every seminar where you get to use quadrillions. Let me unpack those problems with debt to GDP as a metric. So the stock versus flow. If you look at the debt held by the public in 2020 divided by GDP in 2020, you get about a 98% debt to GDP ratio. On the other hand, if you look at the debt held by the public, which is a stock, and divide it by another stock, so you're comparing like to like, the present value of GDP over an infinite horizon, we need a lot of assumptions to that. But it's something like 20 trillion divided by 4 quadrillion, which is 0.5. This 4 quadrillion is very important because any estimate you have of the US fiscal gap, not just backward looking 0.5, but in a moment I'll talk about forward looking, is some percentage of that is doable. If the fiscal gap was 30% of GDP, that might worry me because we'd be going above the top of the Laffer curve and it would be impossible to raise that 30% of GDP. If the fiscal gap is 1% of GDP, 4% of GDP, 8% of GDP, all of those are doable with the United States raising less revenue as a share of the economy than France. It may be desirable, it may be undesirable, but in some sense, by definition, there is no fiscal gap if you include not just the past, but future choices that the government could make. It could choose to raise taxes on a tax base of $4 quadrillion. It's a large tax base. So the first issue is the stock versus flow. The second issue, of course, is that it doesn't reflect interest rates. If interest rates are relatively stable across time, this isn't that big a problem. You can sort of go back and forth between debt and interest. If interest rates are changing, it is. This is a little bit of a polemical way to make this point, but let me be polemical. This is debt held by the public in the United States projected over the next 4 years, and it's projected to rise monotonically. These are net interest payments in the United States over the next 4 years. They're expected to decline monotonically. And so debt and interest are telling us some very different things right now. The first two are reasons why we might worry less. The third problem with debt to GDP, which I take seriously, is that it's backward looking. The debt that we see is everything the United States incurred from 1789 through 2020. It's all the deficits for that nearly 250-year period. The bigger thing is what's coming ahead, and that's not included in the debt numbers. There are measures like the fiscal gap that solve these three problems. They have they compare a stock to a stock. They're forward-looking, and they take into account the interest rate. What worries me about the fiscal gap is how forward-looking they are and some of the uncertainties about how forward-looking one wants to be. So let's talk now about what a better metric is. Interest payments as a share of GDP solve issues 1 and 2. They give you a flow, which is interest payments, and divided by a flow, which is GDP. Right now, that would put you at about 1.5% of GDP, which is towards the low end of the range for the United States historically. So instead of talking about unprecedented and scary debt, we're now talking about quite low debt service, in some sense, a low level of leverage. The better thing to do is real net interest payments, which reflect the fact that you're inflating away the debt. So you subtract some type of expected inflation term from what I just showed you. And you don't care in some sense for debt sustainability, whether you're in a world of 6% interest rates and 4% inflation, or a world of 2% interest rates and 0% inflation. Both of those work out to be the same in terms of sustainability. In that regard, of course, real net interest payments right now are negative and still very much towards the bottom of their historic range.
So Jason, can I just intervene briefly? For you, the low interest rate is essentially a blessing, not a curse. Is this a fair summary, or would you say it has both elements to it? Because when you listen to Larry Summers, he's always worried that the R-star is so low, and that's a problem. How do you balance the two, that it actually has some positive elements and negative elements?
Yeah, so Marcus, I think I don't love the term secular stagnation, because first of all, it sounds like growth, not interest rates. And second of all, it sounds like a bad thing. I think if we went back in time 20 years ago, and I told you, Marcus, hey, here's the message from the future. Interest rates are going to be, 3 points lower than what you're thinking right now. I think on balance, you would have said that was a good thing. That means our debt is more sustainable, etc. You then might have gotten a bit worried about what it means as complications for monetary policy. But those become complications that are actually also more solvable with low interest rates. Every limit they put on monetary policy give you more scope and more need for fiscal policy. So broadly speaking, I think I'd rather be in this low interest rate world than a high interest rate world. I think there are pros and cons to both, but this isn't something like economic growth. Economic growth, sort of generally speaking, the more the better. Interest rates doesn't have that same normative dimension to it. But so I think it's sort of a problem that we've decided to use the word secular stagnation for something that is not obviously a bad thing.
Let me follow up on that. So one thing is, of course, if we look at Brazil, they always had an extremely high interest rate, and for many decades it was thought, the real interest rate is way too high for Brazil and to bring it down. So I agree with you. Some other argument is, of course, that with a low real interest rate, you might also have more financial instability through bubbles and other things which can pop up. And how do you put this in perspective? So we have the zero lower bound problem, and we have potential bubbles popping up.
Yeah.
That might be some side effects. Or...
Yeah. I talked a little bit about the financial stability. I'm a little bit worried about it. I'm not incredibly worried about it, and it's possible I am less worried about it than I should be. But insofar as that's your concern, then you want more debt. You want much more debt. You want an extra 100% of GDP in debt, which maybe that raises the equilibrium interest rate by 2 percentage points. And rather than that being more risk for the economy, that might actually reduce risk because it reduces some of that risk in the financial sector. So, you know, and the people I understand the least are the ones who are simultaneously worried about low interest rates and financial stability and talk about debt reduction. There's sort of an awful lot of them around. Now, they square the circle by saying low rates are a choice by central banks. And if you think they're a choice by central banks, then yes, central banks could raise rates and we could have, you know, bring our debt down. I don't think low rates are a choice by central banks. I think they're ratifying a structural change. And so you sort of need to choose which of those is your bigger worry. Great. This isn't forward-looking though. Nothing in this chart knows that Social Security costs are going up, that Medicare costs are going up, that, you know, what's happening with taxes in the future, et cetera. So the question though is, how much do we want to take that future into account? Our historical forecasts have been very wrong in lots of different directions. In 1992, the General Accountability Office in the United States published forecasts of the debt. They thought the debt was going to be 175% of GDP this year. That was not just them, that was very common for forecasts in the 1990s, looking ahead 20, 25 years to think things like that. In 2000, CBO thought our debt would be more like 50% of GDP. That was just looking 20 years ahead. Didn't know about the financial crisis, it didn't know about the pandemic. Absent those two, maybe CBO would have been right. And then if you look at the forecast CBO made in 2010, it's largely on track with what's actually happening. So just as a pragmatic matter, you know, one wants to place, in some sense, some declining weight if you're making larger reversible choices today based on things where there's a substantial amount of uncertainty in the future. So now let's look at real net interest payments. If you look ahead 5 years, they stay very low. If you look ahead 10 years, they're still relatively low in historical perspective. If you go all the way out to 2050, they keep rising. By 2050, they're at the top of what they've been historically. So maybe we still don't even need to worry a whole lot then. But they're rising. These, by the way, I should say, are based on the Congressional Budget Office's long-run outlook. I build in my own model of dynamics for the interest rate. So I get feedback between the budget. When the deficit's higher, the debt's higher, the interest rate goes higher as a result. So that's what a forward-looking metric looks like. So in summary, in answer to my second question, what metric would I do? I would look at real interest payments as a share of GDP rather than looking at the debt. I would look ahead, but I'd look ahead more like 10 years than 30 years. And insofar as I'm looking ahead 30 years, I'd put sort of an awful lot of blurb around that to reflect the uncertainty. So now let me get to the third question I began with, which is, you know, what our goal is. We now have the measure that we want to look at to think about our fiscal policy. What's our goal for that fiscal policy? To inform that goal, let's look at, note that G has been greater than R for about 2/3 of the last 150 years. Sometimes it's been much, much greater than R. Lately, it's been more like 1.5 percentage points greater than R. Some periods that are different, a lot of them in the further past. We have the familiar debt sustainability metric. And for debt sustainability, you need to know two things. One is, what are G minus R? I show them, break them out separately because I also want to show you a real interest column. So for this column, I needed them separately. But what's G minus R? So G minus R equals 1.5. That's what the Congressional Budget Office has in 2030. That's reasonably consistent with history. I think that's a reasonable forecast. So you pick your G minus R, and then you pick your goal. If you want debt to be 75% of GDP, then you need a primary balance of minus 1.1. You can run a primary deficit of 1.1% of GDP. If you want your debt to be 150% of GDP, then you need a deficit of 2.2. 200% of GDP, 3.0, et cetera. This gives you real interest. So 200% of GDP, under these assumptions, you'd have real interest of 1%. We could make this a matrix and look at more alternative values of G minus R to do a sensitivity and around this. Where does the United States fall in all of this? Our primary deficit in 2019 was about 4% of GDP. If you look forward a decade, it's also about 4% of GDP. So there's some adjustment that would need to be made if we want to asymptote to 200% of GDP. There's a decent size adjustment to asymptote to 150% of GDP. There's a large adjustment to 75. The magnitude of the adjustment, of course, would depend if G minus R differed. A lot of the other G7 economies are actually a lot closer already in terms of their primary balance to what they would need to do to stabilize in the 75 to 150% of GDP range. Want to take this abstract higher level perspective and ask very specifically what this means. And here's where it will differ more and more from country to country. I think any fiscal policy goals, and I do work in economic research, and I do work, and I've spent a lot of time in the government and a lot of time around public policy. I think anything we do in the fiscal space needs to be some combination of optimal, understandable, and achievable. Optimal means, we put it into some model and it tells us this is what we should do. Understandable is policymakers need to understand something. In Germany, for example, they've decided that understanding the black zero, balancing the budget, is understandable. That is a criteria that does very well on understandable. In my view, the black zero does poorly in terms of optimality, and so there's a trade-off. Finally, we need something achievable. We have a long history in a lot of countries of all sorts of fiscal rules that maybe they're decently optimal, maybe even understand them, but just policymakers just don't stick with them, don't believe in them, they don't work. And so I'd rather give up some optimality, give up some understandability in order to have something that I think people could actually talk about and stick to.
Jason, so does understandable mean simple in a sense?
Understandable?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it means that. It means, if it's some complicated dynamic path for something or other based on some model, that doesn't work. And by the way, central banks do this too. Central banks don't just make their monetary policy rules and strategies around what's optimal. They do care about their ability to communicate and understand it. And that's why they have relatively simple frameworks. I think that's even more important for fiscal policy. And some things that are simple and understandable are balance your budget, stabilize your debt, et cetera. The question is, how much are you giving up in other dimensions to have those rules? So in terms of what's optimal, that's an important ingredient in all of this. I know a lot of people say it's important we stabilize the debt, but stabilize where? the poll results in this august group are all over the map. 50%, 100%, 150%, 200%. Where do we want to stabilize? I'll give you my answer. I don't know. I don't have a great way to think about, what that debt stabilization is. In the absence of a great way to think about it, I have the following tentative outcome goal. It is not the solution to some, dynamic optimization problem. It's sort of a hunch. I don't know that it's that great a hunch. I'd love to substitute it with something else, and I'm very open to suggestions. But what I've put down is an outcome goal that real interest doesn't exceed 1% of GDP. That, if you remember historically, was sort of towards, it's been at 2% of GDP before, so that would keep it well within its historic range. Back when it was 2% of GDP, there was a lot of concern about high interest rates constraining capital formation and a desire for debt reduction. That concern's gone away. The other part of this is, in some ways, you want to be sophisticated about how you think about uncertainty in the future, how you think about insurance values. Maybe you add standard errors and reflect the increasing uncertainty over time. I think all of that's too hard to do, so I would just truncate. Look at it for the next decade, ignore it after that. And that's your outcome goal. In terms of input rules and guidelines, I would not suggest that anyone sets up a 1% of GDP real interest as a rule with automatic things that happen if it's not met. I would instead suggest policymakers have input rules or input guidelines, and they adjust those over time if they're not meeting that goal. So what are those? I would say temporary emergency doesn't need to be paid for. And I'd be willing to take a broad definition. Infrastructure, is that the world's most important fiscal stimulus? Probably not. I'm okay counting it as temporary emergency unpaid for. Second is permanent programs are paid for, but make broad exceptions for programs that plausibly pay for themselves in net present value. For example, Hendren and Sprung-Kaiser's evidence and survey of a wide range of programs like early childhood education investments in children that pay for themselves in net present value. At the other end of the spectrum, giving more money to retirees, that might be a nice thing to reduce distress among older Americans. You'd want to pay for that. That wouldn't fall under an exception that might plausibly pay for itself on any time horizon. Third, very parochially for the United States, there's a set of individual tax cuts that expire. I would allow them to expire or replace them with a better tax code that was budget neutral relative to a baseline with their expiration. And then finally, again, parochial for the United States, Social Security is going to be insolvent starting in the 2030s. Within the four walls of Social Security, address solvency with revenue spending. In some sense, this is deficit reduction that is supposed to happen already under the law, number 3 and 4. It just doesn't need to happen immediately. When you run the numbers on all of that, the blue line is the baseline that we have, assuming the tax cuts are permanent. The orange line is the proposed framework. As I said, I would look more at this part of it than I would at the longer term. Over the next decade, this would actually mean more debt and higher deficits than you would have under the baseline. So that's a combination of the upfront stimulus. I just penciled in $2.5 trillion over the next 3 years, along with unpaid for early education and the like. Eventually, it gets bent in the other direction. And as I said, I think the most important way to look at this is federal net real interest payments as a share of the economy. It would keep those below about 1% of GDP, even looking beyond the 10-year window, which I had encouraged you not to do a whole lot to look beyond. So summarizing all of this, should the debt be a constraint on short-term response to a depressed economy? I think the answer is no. What should be a constraint is it a good or bad use of scarce resources? How does it relate to the output gap? Not some abstract concern about debt. The second is, what metric should we use to assess the sustainability of the fiscal trajectory? I think just always turn and look first at real net interest over GDP. And then this is more impressionistic, but looking forward about a decade. Finally, what should we aim for? I suggested a goal of real net interest over GDP of being less than about 1%. That translates into debt to GDP less than about 150 or 200, depending on what real interest rates are. And I suggested that we could, in the United States, be on track to that if, with a large upfront stimulus, with large investments in children, pay for everything else, eventually reform Social Security. But also, to be clear, this is not MMT or extreme fiscal hawk. One needs to update constantly based on what interest rates are, what growth rates are, what macroeconomic circumstances are. So this sort of, roughly speaking, is a compass. And then your means of hitting and staying within that compass, you'd want to update and rethink about over time. So that was everything I wanted to share with you, and happy, Marcus, to be at your disposal for whatever, however you want to handle the questions.
Thanks a lot. That's fantastic, and providing this new framework, how to think about it in a very, in a way which can be implemented in the real world as well, not just in an abstract theoretical model. So I wanted to ask you several questions which also came up in the Q&A, in the electronic Q&A. One is, you focused very much on the US, and you said this for upfront. Of course, the IMF also has some debt sustainability analysis. How would you contrast your way of viewing this with the IMF debt sustainability analysis? Have you thought about this? Or would you say the IMF should also, for other countries, modify the way they analyze, whether debt is sustainable or not?
Right.
Or would you say this goes way beyond what you wanted to say?
Yeah. So I'd love to have a great answer to that. It is. I spent some time looking at IMF debt sustainability analysis. It's so different than what we do in the United States by looking at the Congressional Budget Office numbers, that I want a better crosswalk. I think that as long as you're taking into account, and there's sort of two broad messages in this. One, take account interest rates being lower, but two, don't look too far ahead. When you're looking 30 years ahead, I think that information is almost so useless that I wouldn't make a whole lot of policy based on it today.
So the other thing I would like to ask comes a little bit, as you change the debt level, you might change the risk premia as well. So one thing, the risk-free interest rate came down a lot, but risk premia didn't come down a lot. Do you have an explanation for that? And how would you try to ensure that risk premia stay low as well and promote the real investment? So essentially making the G, focusing more on the G as well, which you did in your suggestion of having this early child investment, which is very much focused on G as well. But you have certain debt which can be a crowding in effect or crowding out effect. So that to distinguish between the two, have you thought about it? Which effect would dominate in your framework and then ultimately affect the G rather than only the R?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the short run, you can have a lot of crowding in for sort of higher expected inflation means lower real interest rate, or just an accelerator model. More, you invest because of growth, you get more growth, you get more investment. And I think you can even, I think you might have said this or started to say it in your intro, end up in a situation where you raise debt less than you raise GDP, and you end up with less debt to GDP. So I think you certainly see that when interest rates are at zero in a depressed economy. You can definitely see that. And that's, by the way, not just in the United States. And by the way, the higher your debt to GDP ratio, the more that what you need to care about is G minus R. So if you're Italy and you have really high debt, I don't think this says, oh, you need lots of, you need to be really constrained at a time like this. I think this says you need to do everything you can to raise G relative to R, because that matters much more for Italy than its primary balance matters for its debt dynamics. So I think this is not just a US lesson. I think in some sense, the more debt you have, the less you can afford to not do a fiscal expansion. There's a lot of negatives. You need to do a fiscal expansion. In the longer run, that's sort of a micro question. And I'm, incredibly partial to investments in children, in case that didn't come across clearly enough. With infrastructure, no, I think you get growth out of it. It makes me a little bit sad that when you lose the pay-fors, you lose the user pays aspect of infrastructure, and having vehicle miles traveled to pay for infrastructure, having a carbon tax to pay for a Green New Deal, et cetera. I think you get as much out of the ways you're paying for it as you do out of the thing itself. So that makes me a little sad.
So finally, I would like to throw in a question about the relative issue. So let's suppose if certain countries go hugely in debt and others don't, do you think there's a problem? Would it be beneficial if all the advanced economies says, okay, we all together go much further into debt simultaneously? Otherwise, there might be a flight to safety into certain countries. If, let's say, the US were to decide to have a lot of extra fiscal space and other countries can't, then there might be more a flight to safety phenomenon compared to a scenario where all countries go in a much deeper. So to what extent would you coordinate internationally the debt to GDP ratio? Also the new measure you proposed?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, in the short run with the fiscal expansion, there's a lot of leakage. Every country will do too little fiscal expansion if it's optimizing just for itself. So having the G7 or G20 at a moment like this, coordinating is important. Within Europe itself, you have a set of asymmetric fiscal rules that basically can get you in trouble for running too big a deficit. They can't get you in trouble for running too small a deficit. You have Maastricht criteria that were made, set 28 years ago when the interest rate was, I think 8% in Germany or something, as opposed to negative, which it is right now. So I think a lot of that is outdated. And yes, I think, one country's, ability to borrow depends in part on what others are doing. If there's an asteroid making its way to the Earth, and every country decides it needs to borrow to stop this asteroid, and debt goes up to 500% of GDP, I think we'd be fine. People would say, oh, we know why you're borrowing, you're all borrowing. If on the other hand, every country in the world had relatively low debt, and somebody in the United States just went nutty and decided to build a giant pyramid in the middle of country and got up to 300% debt to GDP because of that, the United States would have a harder time borrowing in that second circumstance than the first. So it's not just the debt, it's a little bit why you have the debt, what others are doing on the debt, and some greater global coordination around all of that, even just in our understanding of it, I think would be helpful.
I guess the asteroid is called COVID in your example. So we typically in this webinar, we end on a positive note. So you have some last point to make, which is give some positive perspective given the COVID crisis and other elements. So if you have any optimistic forecast, I guess your presentation was very optimistic overall and not depressing, but perhaps you can add another positive aspect to it.
Right. Let me just say two things. One is our economies have done better than I expected through this point in time. And the vaccine news is better than expected. We're going through a really horrific point in time right now. We can end the supply problem with a vaccine. We still had a lot of empty restaurants, by the way, in the year 2009. That wasn't because people were afraid to eat in restaurants. That's because they couldn't afford to eat in restaurants. That problem, at least we know exactly how to solve. We don't need to invent some new instrument to help people to afford to be able to eat in restaurants once the unbelievably brilliant, amazing innovations that have led to this vaccine come into place. So, I can see to the end of this economic problem. It's going to require more than a vaccine. It will require some economic medicine, but I think we, broadly speaking, know that medicine. And at the level of the debate on, international institutions, major economists, et cetera, I think there's more unanimity around that economic medicine and what it is now than I can remember at any point in my career engaging with economic policy. So we know what we need to do. We just need to do it.
Thanks a lot, Jason. It was a pleasure to listen to your thoughts and thinking how to fix the economy and how to get out of it. Hopefully very well. And the vaccine is coming. So we will have a tough winter ahead, but after the winter, everything looks upward. Thanks again, and hope to see you soon again in the real world, not only virtually. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus.